Hello again, fifth years. Moving on with our second lesson. We're doing the introduction to core social studies. You should have your core studies out with you. We're going to begin looking at the sociological concepts. You have the explanations for these in your notes. These are definitions. It's important that you learn them. They come up pretty regularly, and they came up in question 5 on last year's paper. So what is society? Well, society is a large group of people who share a way of life. Irish society is an example of a large society, and the school society here is an example of a small society. So our next word is culture. So culture in the context of social studies is the beliefs, customs, language, values, norms, and roles of a group of people. So, for example, in Ireland, we would have certain cultures that are not shared by other nationalities. Coming up to St. Patrick's Day, we have St. Patrick's celebrations, we have Irish music, Irish dancing, the Irish language, and these are things we share, a culture we share. And culture is passed on from one generation to the next. So norm. Norm is an accepted form of behaviour in society. Norms either support or forbid a type of behaviour. And we learn our norms in our families. And something that you learn in your family as a norm, as you get older, becomes a law in society. So a small example of that is young children, children of say 3 years of age who are playing side by side, and Johnny wants the toy Mary is playing with. What will Johnny do? He will snatch the toy from Mary, and whatever adult is present will probably say, that's not very nice, you need to learn to share, you can't take from other people. But as you get older and you become an adult, if you take something that doesn't belong to you, that's stealing. So norms are very important, and norms are something we learn primarily at home and children in school, because school rules would also enforce societal norms. So moving on to mores. Mores are norms, values, and customs that a society considers to be important. So an example of this in Ireland is social welfare. We decided when we became a state that we wanted a social welfare system that all working people would pay into. So we all pay tax, we pay PRSI, and in particular, our PRSI and USC payments go to pay for our social welfare system, because we as a society are more decided we should look after the divided by values. So values are beliefs held by an individual or a group. And we would have values as a family. We'll also have values as a society. And a good example of family values, for example, you are a teenager and you're 14, you want to go to a party, and you come home and you say to your mum or dad, I want to go to a party, it's over at such and such time, it's in such and such place. And your parents say no. And then you say, but everyone else in the class is going to that party. But your family values may be different to other people's family values. And your parents will make the decisions they feel are in your best interest based on their value system. So a role. A role is an expected form of behaviour, and people can have more than one role. So you could be a parent, you could also be a nurse, you could also be captain of the golf club, you will also have a role as a sister, as a daughter, so we can have many roles at the same time. Status. We nominally in Ireland don't have social status like they do in the UK, for example, where they have a royal family, they have dukes and duchesses, they have people who are sir and lady so-and-so, they have a very defined upper class, middle class and lower class. But we have a little bit of that in Ireland based on status. So we would regard people with very high paying jobs, perhaps, as of higher status. We might regard professionals like doctors and lawyers as having higher status in society. And you'll notice a lot of the UK system is born into a particular social status. In Ireland, we earn it. You know, you earn it by your qualifications and by income. So a socioeconomic group, this leads us on from our social, like I said, we don't have a defined for middle and lower class, but we do have socioeconomic groups. So socio refers to society, economic refers to money. And we do tend to divide our society according to income. Those on a lower income might be considered a lower socioeconomic status, middle incomes might be considered middle class, and those with a high income might be considered to have a higher socioeconomic status. So what is social mobility? Well, mobility is the ability to move, and our social mobility can be to do with moving from one socioeconomic group to the other. Or it could be physically moving to a different geographical area. And what allows us to have social mobility in Ireland is primarily education. Because if you become more educated than your parents, if you achieve a higher level of educational attainment, so in other words, you get maybe third level, maybe you get a master's, that's going to put you in a position to get a very well-paid job. And that's going to allow you to move to a different socioeconomic group. And during times of recession, in particular the recession that we're just emerging from, people often had to physically move for work. They had to emigrate to find employment. They had to maybe move to a different part of the country to find employment. And something new we saw with the last recession was that sometimes families split up. You might have had one parent moving to work in London Monday to Friday or other parts of Europe or the world and doing long commutes, you know, a commute from one country to another. Okay, so our primary social group is a group of people that we mix with a lot. So it would include your family and it would include close friendship groups. Your secondary social group are people you see pretty regularly. So you might include some classmates in that you'd be friendly with, but not see a lot outside of school. It could be a sports club. It could be an activity that you take part in, would be your secondary social group. Now, socialization, this is where people learn how to fit into society. They learn how to fit into their family, their school, their employment, their leisure activities. And we have primary socialization. This takes place in the home. So primary and we have secondary socialization. And primary socialization will include what's acceptable forms of behaviour. And we had the example a few minutes ago of the two children, one snatching a toy out of another. But if you have two siblings playing together and one slaps the other, you know, they would be told fairly quickly that's unacceptable behaviour. Because as you grow up and you go out into school, you go out into the workplace, you go out into society, slapping someone is assault. So learning primary socialization in the home, the rights and wrongs, you can think about primary socialization as that voice in your head. You know when something is wrong, and you know it's wrong because you have been taught the norms, values, and behaviours acceptable in your society. And then you carry that on into your secondary socialization, where things like school rules, school ethos, rules of a game you might play like hockey or basketball, all reinforce primary socialization. And like I said, we can't go out into society without any socialization because we have laws that prevent us from behaving in an antisocial manner. So social institutions are organised social arrangements. And two good examples of that are things like marriage. So most societies base their society on the family, whatever that family might be. And so a social institution that creates a family is marriage. It's a binding contract. Another example of social institutions is how we organise our society. So social institutions include things like the healthcare system, education system, policing and the law. As a society, we set up a lot of social institutions, and they're ways for us to manage our society. Now, we're going to concentrate mostly as we go through the content of the core social studies on social change. How have the last 100 years affected our families, affected our marriages? How has technology changed our lives and how we do things? How have scientific developments changed our lives and how we do things? So there's a lot of new terminology in this, so we're going to move over to the next board and have a look at some of the terminology. So as we move through the last 100 years, you will see that we have gradually moved from extended families to nuclear families, and we look in detail at the characteristics of these families later. But an extended family is what Ireland would have had in the past. This is a group of people, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all living in close proximity, probably being dependent on either the land, so like a family farm, or the sea. Maybe they were a fishing family. Nowadays, we see more nuclear families, smaller family units living independently and providing economically for themselves. In the past, we had a high rate of child mortality, that is, children dying during their childhood. And lots of things have changed child mortality. Better health system, better nutrition, better cleanliness, vaccinations. All of these have contributed to the reduction in child mortality. Now, patrilineal refers to how we used to inherit. Ireland, like I said to you before, was very rural, it was very poor. They often had very large families because we had no contraception. And inheritance was down the male line, patrilineal inheritance. It meant the eldest son inherited. You might be outraged by that, but there was a very practical reason for it. If they had 8 children, 6 children, they could divide up a small farm in 6 or 8 ways. It wouldn't be economically viable. So what often happened is the eldest son inherited. The next son either became a priest or emigrated or moved to a city to try and get a job. If the daughters didn't get married or become nuns, they also had to either emigrate or move to seek employment. What we have nowadays in Ireland is what we call bilineal inheritance. So we have most people are not economically dependent on the land or on the sea, so they leave their assets divided equally among their spouse and children. So equity, something we'll be talking about a lot. How has our society become more equal? It's become particularly more equal between men and women. And we now have wide acceptance in dual career families, so both partners working. We mentioned emigration in the last lesson. What we have had in the last 2 years is a lot of immigration. This is people moving from other countries into our country, contributing to our society, working in our companies, bringing their food culture with them. So, cohabiting, living together before marriage, this has become very widely socially accepted. The social welfare system we mentioned, we are a welfare provider, less fortunate ourselves through a range of welfare payments. We have moved to be an urban society. We are now 70% urban dwellers, city dwellers, as opposed to rural. That has led to a lot of problems in rural areas. They've had a lot of schools closing, banks, post offices, poor public transport in rural areas, and what we call rural isolation, where you've elderly people whose family members are not living near them, and they're lonely, they're scared, because we have a lot of, unfortunately, isolated rural areas. Mobility is our ability to move within our society, and we mentioned already our education allows us to do that. Inheritance we have covered. So patriarchal. In the past, Ireland was a very patriarchal society. It was patriarchal, is ruled by men. So fathers would have been very, austere, traditional. They would have done the men's jobs, earned the money, maybe cut the grass and do a bit of DIY, but gender roles were very defined. And the man made the decisions and ruled the family. Matriarchal, that traditionally now it's becoming more equal. So families would have been what we call authoritarian. The father made the rules, implemented the rules, including for the wife, and everybody else obeyed. This would be our tradition, which we've moved away from, thankfully. So we're going to move on now and look at some of the changes that have taken place in families. So we're moving on to page 4 in our notes, where we're looking at the historical development of the family. So starting at the beginning of the 20th century, 100 years ago, families were there were very defined roles. There were things men did and boys did, and there were very defined roles that women did. In particular, they did all of the child rearing, all of the domestic work. Their daughters would have helped them out with that. 70% of Irish people lived in rural areas, 30% living in cities. In the countryside, many of people worked as farm labourers if they didn't have their own farms. They usually lived in single-storey houses, approximately 2 rooms, so people living very much on top of each other, no electricity, usually growing their own food, milking their cows to make butter and cheese, so very limited diet. And the families who lived in towns and cities were a little bit better off. They got electricity sooner, there were opportunities for employment, but cities would have terrible slums. In particular, in the tenement houses, no indoor plumbing, so toilets outside, no running water, very difficult family circumstances. So we're going to start going through some of the timelines for the historical changes. And our first timeline is 1900 to 1930. So what was life like between 1900 and 1930 here in Ireland? Well, the woman's role was to look after the home, help on the farm if she was a rural dweller, rear the family. There was no contraception, so women had to endure many pregnancies. Families were big. The average was 6 children. The death of a mother in childbirth was a constant threat, because who was going to look after the children? Who was going to do the cooking and the laundry? Men didn't involve themselves in any of those roles. Ireland was very much a male-dominated society. Few women worked outside the home. The husband and father was very much an authoritarian figure, patriarchal society. He was a strict disciplinarian. The children were controlled, very much do as you were told. And the father would have had a poor relationship with his children, not like nowadays. It would have been quite a distant relationship. And children were considered an economic benefit. Now you're considered an economic drain, unfortunately. Children were expected to contribute once they had finished primary school, particularly if they were in rural areas. They had to help out in the farm, they had to do the labouring in cities. They often got jobs as delivery boys, working in laundries. They were expected to economically contribute much earlier. So moving on from the 1930s to the 1960s, what was life like? So 1930s, life remained very much the same for women. Their lives revolved around the home and the family. They'd few social outings. Remember we said before they weren't allowed in pubs. And once their families grew up and left home, they were very isolated and lonely. We mentioned already rural electrification. This changed the lives of women in rural areas very much. So by the 1950s, they were beginning to come out of the recession after World War II. Rural electrification was in place. People started to get modern technological machines. Women's health improved, healthcare systems improved, and they started having fewer children. So we're going to leave it there for this lesson. We'll move on from 1960 and continue the historical development of the family in our next lesson.